Loud and clear. That's what I like to hear. Awesome. So, today we got something a little bit special for everyone, and this is an introduction to the Flask web framework. Now, if you're not familiar with Flask, this is a backend web framework in Python, and it's the one that I have used the most, and it's one that I really love. So I'm super excited to be sharing it with all of you today, and I hope you learned something new. As you can see from the screen, if you go to flask.winhacks.ca, you'll be able to see on our GitHub, we have the sample code that I'm going to be building today. So if you want to check out the sample project, then you can take a look at it there. And to give you a sneak peek of what we're actually going to be building, I can show you. It's a very simple shopping list application. So let's say you want to add plum pudding to your shopping cart. So you added it, you go view, and then there you go. And say, oh, I actually want pizza to be capitalized or something like that. You can update it and then say, actually, we don't need any sort of drawing tablet, so we're going to delete that one. And there you go. So that's the kind of thing we're going to be building today. And we'll be building it from scratch, except for maybe some of the styling. I'm just going to be copy pasting, but everything else, it's going to be super simple, and it's going to be great. So a little bit about me, if you don't know me. So my name is Jeremy Bornay, of course, and I'm the president of the University of Windsor's Computer Science Society this year. I'm also the co-founder of the WinHacks and BorderHacks hackathons and the lead organizer of WinHacks this year. I'm currently a software developer intern at Ascent, and I was last summer at Green Shield Canada. I'm currently working as a research assistant. I was a project lead for the Google Developer Student Clubs last year. I'm a 10x hackathon participant. And if you're interested in some of my links, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, check out my code on GitHub, or take a look at my website that should probably be updated. So to get into the agenda of what the event is actually going to look like, so firstly, we're going to go through some slides and whatnot about what exactly Flask is, an overview of what it is, how people use it, why you should consider using it in your own event or in your own web app. Then we're going to go over the very, very simple instructions required to get it up and running and installed. Then we're going to, kind of go over the structure of a Flask app, like the bare bones of it. After that, we are going to get into routes and templates. So that's kind of actually adding real HTML to the web app. And then from there, we'll get into some next steps. So, all the different things you can add in addition to Flask to take your web app to the next level. So, adding SQL Alchemy, user authentication, stuff like that. We're going to touch on that. I'm not going to show you how to do everything like that because that's a little bit beyond what we can do here, but I'll definitely touch on it a little bit. And then last but not least, we'll have an interactive demo where I'll actually be showing you how to make your own Flask website that I showed you before. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So what exactly is Flask and why should you use it, right? So what is Flask? It's a micro web framework written in Python. And we use the word micro because it's something that at the very base level, Flask can be very, very, very tiny, right? So you don't need this huge monolithic framework or like 100 files just to get started with Flask. It's very, very small out of the box. So you use this for coding the back end of websites. So this is where you do things like user authentication, databases, as well as serving static content. It's very light, as I said before. And there's a bunch of additional add-ons that you can use to scale your web app. So, some of these that I mentioned, WT Forms for forms, SQL Alchemy for databases, and Flask login for user authentication. Those are all really solid things that you can use alongside it. But at its base, Flask is just Flask. These are just add-ons for it. So why should you use it, right? Everyone knows about Django and Ruby on Rails and .NET, all these crazy frameworks, and there's a ton of them. But why use Flask, right? Well, it's very simple to get started. If you've ever tried using something like Ruby on Rails, it can be a bit daunting to get started with all these different files and stuff. Whereas with Flask, it's you can just start with one file and like 6 or 7 lines of code to get your first server up and running. So it's super, super simple to get started with. And like I mentioned before, you don't have to make it that simple. There's many, many great add-ons that you can add to make it work like something a little bit like Django or Ruby on Rails. It's very hackathon friendly. So from our viewers joining from WinHacks, if you're looking to build a web app that includes some database functionality and stuff, then it's super, super friendly with stuff like this because it's quick to pick up. And like I said, it's not huge where you need to spend weeks just getting started with it. And the other thing is it scales well. So you can start off very small and simple, but you can use these add-ons and you can even develop your own stuff to scale your web app and make it nice and big. So you can start small and scale up to build something really cool. And it's one of the most customizable because, like I said, at its base, Flask is very small and it doesn't do a lot of things out of the box for you. So it's very, very customizable. If you want to have your own way of rendering templates or your own way of handling forms or your own way of handling databases, you can 100% do that very, very easily. Now, that's not always recommended, but for certain use cases, it's definitely something that's nice to have, right? So how do you install Flask? How do you get started with it, right? And really, it's just a pip install away. So if you're familiar with, coding in Python, pip or pip3 is how you install third-party packages. So pip install Flask, that's how you get started. But to talk more about the requirements for what you need to get started, you'll need Python 3.5 plus. So we're not working with Python 2 here. As long as this is something that is within the past couple of years, then you'll be fine. And if you don't have Python and pip installed, then just go to python.org and install it. Easy peasy. But yeah, and you must also have pip installed, which should come with Python if you're downloading it on like Windows or something. But if you're on Linux or maybe Mac OS, I'm not sure, you might need to install it. So I'm seeing a question, should I use WSL? And the answer to this really is it depends. The good thing about Python is it works pretty well cross-platform. So for this tutorial, I'm going to be going over it in Windows, just because I assume most of the people here are using Windows. But if you do want to use WSL or Linux or Mac OS, the instructions are pretty much exactly the same. So you won't have to worry about that. But yeah, for the purposes of the interactive demo at the end, I'm going to just be using PowerShell. So don't worry about having WSL or anything configured. But yeah. So virtual environments or VENV, it's recommended to use this. But if you don't know what this is and maybe you're a bit confused, you're like, what is a virtual environment? Don't worry about it because, for the purposes of this, we're not going to get into it too much. But just note, if you're building a web app with Flask, it's recommended to use virtual environments. And I'll be using it today, but I won't be getting into the nitty-gritty with it. But yeah, after you have Python and pip installed, and if you're using a virtual environment, you have that set up, it's just a pip install Flask to install Flask. And do note, you might need to use pip 3 instead of pip. So as AA 2020 was saying, if you're using WSL, you're probably going to need to use pip 3. So just take note of that if you're trying to run pip install Flask and it's not working. But yeah. And yeah, if you need to download Python and pip, just go to python.org and it's right there for you. Just install whatever the latest long-term support version is. So your first app. So what's the boilerplate to actually get started with Flask, right? So the bare minimum. So this nice fancy code font, this would be in like your app.py file or whatever. So the first thing you're going to do is import Flask. Next is you make an instantiation of Flask, which you call app. And this is like the actual web app, right? So you do this app equals Flask name, and that kind of instantiates Flask and creates your web app for you. And the next thing is this function decorator, which is at app.route/. And so this is like when you have a website and like say it's example.com. So this is where you would put /about or /contact/login. So we put a slash here to just denote it's at the very base of the web application. And that's like /home is like the same thing, right? And then def hello world. So if you're not familiar with Python, this is how you define a function. And so we're just calling this the hello world function. So whenever you go to the slash here, it runs this hello world function. And what you see is it returns the string hello world. And that is all you need to actually get the Flask part running, right? So when you go to slash, it just returns the text hello world, right? So that's what's going to happen. And then the next few lines, these are going to be how we actually get running with our app. So if name is equal to main, again, if you're familiar with Python, this is kind of like when you run like Python 3 app.py, this is the part that runs. This is your main function, right? So you do app.run, debug is equal to true. And that's what actually runs the web app. So, to go over it, this first 5 lines is just setting up your Flask server, and the next 2 lines is just actually running it. All right. So what are you going to do? You're going to save this file to app.py or website.py or whatever you want. And then you're just going to run Python or Python 3 app.py. And yeah, like I said, you may need to use Python 3 app.py instead. And actually on Windows, for me, it's just py. So it's py app.py. And then lastly, you go to localhost port 5000 and your website will be ready for you to view. So how do we commonly structure a Flask app, right? Like, yeah, sure, we've got that one app.py, but we're not just going to put a bunch of text in return statements and that's our web app, right? So how do we actually structure a Flask app? So, the file you just saw, the app.py, this is where you handle all of the backend stuff, your routes, your database stuff. Everything can be in this one app.py. And when you scale your app, you may actually turn this into something that's called a module, and you'll be able to separate your app into different Python files. But for the purpose of this and for simple Flask apps, we'll just be using one app.py file. So next we have a secrets.json, and this file just contains in the case of our app that we're going to make, it's just going to contain our secret key, which is just some random string of characters that you put in, for security reasons and whatnot. But sometimes you'd also include other configuration details. So this could be a config.json instead of a secrets.json. But this is, something that you wouldn't push to GitHub because it would contain sensitive information that you don't want to the public, right? So then you have a folder which is called the static folder. And this folder contains all your CSS, images, JavaScript, things that you're going to want to serve just static content files to the web. So like I said, you're going to put a style.css or a script.js or whatever in there, or a favicon.ico or a logo.png, stuff like that. You're always going to throw in the static folder. And then so the next folder you need to know about is templates. And so this is going to contain all the HTML that you want rendered by the web browser when you return, right? So a lot of times you'll have like a layout.html or a base.html. And this is something that's cool about Flask and these, backend frameworks, is you can have a base HTML file that contains your nav bar, your metadata, and all this cool stuff. And then when you get into files like your home.html, you actually only need like one line of text or 2 lines of text, and your things like your nav bar and all that will automatically be in there. So this is what the templates folder is for, your HTML files and whatnot. I'm seeing a question. What is the secrets.json file for? So the purpose of the secrets.json file is to keep all your configuration details. So this might be like API keys. In our case, it's going to be a secret key that we put in there, which again is just some random string of characters that we use to configure the website. But in the past, I've had like, information about what port that I want to run the website on in production, some domains and stuff that I have attached to it. So it's really useful for a bunch of different reasons, and it will really depend on what your app is. And to be honest, you can exclude it entirely, but it's always good to have a configuration file like this so that you can store the sensitive information separate from the code. So that's kind of what the secrets.json file is for. And I'm seeing another question here. Could you put a Python file in the static folder? And the answer is yes, but you probably wouldn't want to. And the reason for that is the static folder is a special folder for Flask where it's just for serving the actual content of the files, right? So the only reason why you would put a Python file in the static folder is if you wanted people to, say, be able to view the contents of that file or be able to download the file. You wouldn't be using the static folder to contain Python files that you're going to run. So in the past, when I separate my Flask app into different Python files, what I do is instead of this app.py, what I'll do is I'll change it to a run.py, which just handles running the website. And then I'll create a website folder, which actually becomes a Python module. And then I put all my code in there. But again, you can also just keep your Python files at the base of the repository or of the folder, and it'll work the same as well. But yeah, you wouldn't normally put a Python file in the static folder just because that's not what the static folder's for, right? If you want to run the file, then you'll put it somewhere else. So yeah, that's the common structure of a Flask app. And like I said, the great thing about Flask is that it's very, very customizable. So even things like the templates folder and the static folder, you can change, but this is kind of the base way of doing it, and it's the most common. And if you want to keep up with best practices, at the very least, you should keep the static and the templates folder the same as I have it here. The other stuff can change, but these two folders are the most important. So how do we actually have some fun with it and create different routes and different templates so we can have actual real HTML? So first thing you need to know about is some common functions that you're going to encounter when using Flask. And the first is render template. And this is very simply a function that you use. You pass in a file name and it'll render that HTML file, and it will you return that to return the web page to the user. So if you go back to the templates folder, you would do like render template layout.html, because it searches the templates folder automatically and it'll render that that file for you. So the next one you're going to use is URL4. And this is important because when you have a bunch of different routes and you're changing them and you're using multiple domains and stuff, it can get pretty hairy to just put in absolute and even relative paths to these routes. Like instead of putting /about, you put URL4 about, right? And it just makes it cleaner because you don't have to worry about if something changes, making sure you update it in every single little place, right? For example, you may want to say, I don't want to call the login page sign in. I want to call it login, right? So instead of changing everything to /login from /sign in, you just change the name of the route. So, or the name of the function that is defined for that route. And, it's very useful for that. And it's also very useful for dynamic links. So URL for view, and then you pass in something like the ID of a particular database entry. So it's very good for dynamic stuff. And also it plays very nicely with static content. So you put URL for static and you would, include your CSS files there. So that's another way you use URL for. And then there's redirect. And this is very simply just instead of rendering a template, you just redirect the user to a different URL or route. And oftentimes you will return a redirect, and then you'll also use URL for inside of it to redirect to a different route on the website. So redirect and URL for play very nicely together. So now that I bored you a little bit with talking about those three base functions, let's actually show how to get a couple of routes up and running. So you have your route /about, and then you define a function for it, def about, and then you return render template. So again, this is going back to that render template function I mentioned before, about.html. So this is going to return to the user the contents of the about.html file. And render template automatically looks in the templates folder. So you don't have to specify templates /about.html. And then again, if you want to do something like contact app.route/contact, def contact, return render template contact.html. Very, very simple. And these are the simplest routes that you'll ever encounter. In between this def contact and return render template, you can have any other stuff that may include database entries or queries and stuff like that. And that's kind of the beauty of using something like Python, right? Is you can do all this stuff in between so that you're not just rendering the template. But again, for the sake of this, these are two very, very simple routes that you can use. And again, a reminder, if anyone has any questions or if I'm going too fast, too slow, or something's confusing, feel free to ask a question in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring it throughout the whole stream, so don't worry. But moving on, so if you want to pass in data to routes, something like a specific ID for a shopping cart item, right? Which is kind of related to what we're going to be making today. So the thing is here, so let's say you're doing some sort of blog and you're trying to see a specific post, right? So the way you define a variable in a route is with these less than symbols and greater than symbols, and then the name of the variable in there. And then def posts, and then as you can see, this post ID correlates to the post ID within the function. And let's see, I'm assuming those simple routes would go into the app.py file in the beginning. I'm seeing a question. And yeah, exactly. So if I go back to, come on. I go back here, yeah, these would just be in your app.py before you actually do your if name is equal to main stuff. So that's where you would include that. So let's move on. So yeah, this is a way to dynamically put in some variable, which we're going to call post ID in here. So we have our def posts, and then here we're going to do something with our post ID. Maybe we'll query it or delete it, or do something funky with it. But this is where you would do it right after you define your function, and then you're going to return a template. And I'm not too sure why I put about.html here, but that's what I put. And yeah, it can be anything here, but this is how you kind of get a function or a specific ID or specific data into a route. So how would you link this route with URL4? So if, say, you wanted to view post 4, right? The way you use URL4 in some link, so this href, so you use these double fancy bracket thingies here to define like the Jinja 2 syntax, which is what renders these templates. So this right here is technically Python code, right? This URL4 posts. And basically what this is going to turn into is localhost 5000 /posts/4. That's what that'll end up turning into. Curly brackets, yeah. That's what you use for Flask to have things like this rendered to the user. Use the curly brackets. So URL4, so this string that's posts, what that refers to is this function name, right? So that's what that posts is for. And then you're adding in, as you can see, there is a variable here, post ID. There's a parameter. So that's why you throw in there post ID is equal to 4. And that's how you kind of passing data to routes. And it'll make a little bit more sense when we get into the actual coding of the web app. So here's an example of how you can use templates to very drastically decrease the amount of boilerplate code that you have to write. So like I said before, a lot of times you'll have something like a layout.html. They'll have all of this stuff that, you're not going to be writing over and over again, like your title, your metadata. And then in here, you'll see what I highlighted is this block content. And so what that is it's defining a block where, in some other HTML file, you can throw stuff in between there, and then it'll kind of be thrown directly in there so that like if you go to the home.html, you can put this h1 tag and it'll go right in there when you render home.html. So again, going to home.html, so it's extending this layout.html. And so again, what this extends mean is that when you go to home.html, it's going to copy everything from layout.html, and then everything in between this block and end block is going to be thrown in right here. And that's what gets returned to the user. So this is very useful for things, like I said, this boilerplate, but it's also super good if you have like a nav bar or something that you want on every single page, but you don't want to have to copy and paste it. So if you make a change, you don't have to change in every single little file. So instead of having, 10 or 12 lines of code to get this home.html, you only need 4, right, to get all of that boilerplate. So that's a really cool thing about Flask, and a reason why, even if I'm not doing anything crazy, sometimes I'll use Flask just because, I have things like a nav bar that I want on every page. So some other cool stuff that you can do is you can do a for loop. So say there's a list of 5 contacts. This will, so say it's contact A, B, C, D, and E. This will create 5 H3s, and in between, it'll have A, B, C, D, E, like that. So that's a cool way to dynamically create HTML. And another thing you can do is use an if statement. So the example I gave here is part of a module called Flask Login for user authentication. So this is like an example of, if they're on some page and you want to say welcome to them, or if, they're not supposed to be on that page because they got to log in first, you can put an H3 that says login, right? So that's another cool way that you can use Flask. So next steps. So that's a lot of the base stuff. So how do you, what stuff is out there to extend your app's functionality, right? And there's a few of them, right? So I'm not going to get into any of these here today except for Flask SQL Alchemy. But Flask WTF is a handy way to use like Python classes and stuff to dynamically generate HTML forms. And it makes it easy when passing data in and out of these forms. So I highly recommend that if you're going to make something a little bit bigger. SQL Alchemy is an object relational mapper for converting like SQL to Python code, right? So you can talk to a SQL database without actually writing any SQL, which is super cool, and it's something we're going to get into later. Flask login, user sessions, if you've ever coded it by hand, it's not exactly the most fun to do, and Flask login handles that for you. So this is a way to make user authentication super, super simple with Flask. Next, we have, I'm not too sure actually how you're supposed to pronounce this, Gunicorn, G-Unicorn, whatever it is. It's a way of hosting your, like serving your Flask app. And a lot of times you'll use it with a reverse proxy like Caddy, which we'll actually be talking about next week in the deploying a website talk. But a lot of times you use something like this with Caddy to easily deploy your app. So that's something that's cool. Again, won't get into it today, but something to look into. Flask uploads makes, handling user file uploads and stuff simple and secure. It can be kind of a pain to deal with that by hand. So using something like that is a huge help. And then the last one is bcrypt. And this is just a handy Python package you can use to hash and check passwords. So you can make authentication a lot more secure. You're not using plain text to store user passwords, which is a huge security problem. So bcrypt is one of those ways to negate it a bit. So now that I've talked your ear off quite a bit, um, with these slides, let's actually make something, all right? And as I showed you before, this is the app we're going to be making. So it's going to be a shopping list application. And so there's a few things you can do. You can view items. You can add an item. So again, let's add another one. Pizza, view items, and you can see it there. You can update it. Pizza pockets. There you go. It's updated. And you can also delete. So this is commonly referred to as a CRUD app: create, read, update, and delete. And it's actually very, very interesting with just the functionality that you learn with this very simple app. You can do a lot. So CRUD is kind of the basic, the base of a lot of much more complicated websites, much more powerful websites too, right? So although this may seem a little useless for right now, you can actually extend it to make something a lot more cool. And lastly, just to kind of show you, all of the sample code is on the WinHacks GitHub organization. So it's WinHacks/Flask Workshop. And you can also go to flask.winhacks.ca and it'll bring you here. So you can view the slides. You can check out another helpful tutorial from Free Code Camp. And this is actually what I loosely based this shopping list application on. And it also includes some instructions on getting this set up. But that's not what we're here for today. We're here to actually create it. So I am going to open up my terminal and we're going to create something from scratch. So I'm going to go into my projects folder and I'm going to make a directory and I'm going to call it shopping list. And I'm going to open that up in Visual Studio Code. And of course, it's off screen for right now, but here we are. And I'll make it a little big for everyone. There we go. Can you send the link? Flask.winhacks.ca. So yeah, flask.winhacks.ca, that's the link to check out the sample code. But let's actually get into creating something. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new file, and I'm going to call it app.py. Right? And actually before that, new terminal, just so I have a terminal here. And boy, when I'm streaming, the computer really chugs a little bit, but that's no issue. So this is how you create a virtual environment, pi-mv-nv-v-nv. And this is just a good way to keep all your packages in like one place and not install it globally. It's not strictly necessary for this tutorial. And actually, it looks like it's taken a while, but that's no matter. And there we go. Okay, so I'm going to activate it, vnv/scripts/activate. And there we go. So now all I got to do is pip install Flask, and I'm also going to install something called Flask SQL Alchemy. And what that will do is give us all the Flask stuff that we need, and also the related like SQL stuff, so that we can work with our database. And there we go. So now that that's set up, we can actually get coding our very first app. So from Flask, import Flask, right? That's the most important thing. And now we need to instantiate it. App is equal to Flask, and you throw in name. And that should be all you need for that, I believe. Then it's just at app.route, and we're going to put it in the slash, and we're going to call this home, so def home, and we're going to return the string hello world. And we're going to save that. And then the last thing we need to do is set it up so that we can actually run this. And I have it here. I'm just going to copy and paste it. So it is actually, that is related to the database stuff, which we don't need yet. So if name is equal to main, we're going to app.run debug is equal to true. Now, when you're actually deploying this, you want the debug to be false, but for this, so we're going to do py app.py and give it a second, and you can see if I can open this up and open up in the wrong browser, but that's okay. You can see hello world. Very exciting. And to show that it's actually doing what I'm saying it's doing, let's change this to an h1 tag, and we'll save it. And you can see it automatically reloads for you. And let's just go back here and refresh, and you can see it's an h1. And so if you inspect it to kind of look at what's actually rendered, it's just this h1 hello world, right? So we didn't give it a bunch of other stuff, so it's only the hello world that's actually rendered. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that's boring. We don't want just that. I'm seeing a question. What is the command you entered for venv? So if you're on Windows, to start it, it's pi-mv-nv-venv, which I just put in the chat, pi-mv-nv-venv. And if it's, you might need to put Python 3 or Python instead of pi. But then after that, it's venv/scripts/activate. And that will activate the virtual environment. Again, it's not super important that you do that for the purposes of something as simple as this, but in the long run, using a virtual environment is it's very useful, and it ends up causing a lot of issues to go away if you do it like that. But that is how you do that. So now, this is very boring. Let's actually get some stuff going with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is create my static folder, and I'm going to create a file in there called style.css. And I already have a handy style.css handy that I'm going to paste in. And a lot of this stuff is just, making the nav bar pretty and making the table look nice, changing like the text inputs and whatnot. For the purposes of this, this isn't a CSS tutorial, so I'm not going to be going over all of this, but it's good to know. You can copy and paste this if you want yourself. But now we have that, and I think that's all we need for static. We're also going to need the templates folder. So we're going to go to templates, and the first thing we're going to want to create is layout.html. So again, this layout.html is the very base HTML file with all our metadata and all that fancy stuff that we're going to extend with all of our other templates. So handy shortcut in VS Code to generate a bunch of boilerplate is to just do an exclamation mark and then enter, and all of this stuff gets generated. So we're going to change the title to shopping list, and there you go. There's our body. So the next thing you need to actually do is define that block, right? So you're going to do block content and block. All right. And so now this is done. We'll add more to it in a little bit, but for now, that's fine. And then we're going to create another one. We're going to call it home.html. And this is going to be our for our home page. So the first thing you do, these guys here, extends, and that in quotations, layout.html. And remember, what this does is it copies everything from layout.html, and then everything in between the block is what you input here. So you're going to do block content, and then end block. Right, and then in here you're going to do an H1, and same thing, hello world, and we're going to save that. Now, of course, we haven't actually, we're not actually rendering it yet, right? So we also need render template, and then back here, instead of returning this, we're going to do return render template home.html. And what this will do now is it'll render this home.html file. So let's go back and refresh. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a change just from there, but you can also see that the title has changed, right? And if you actually inspect it to see what we're actually dealing with, then you can see all the stuff that we added in the layout.html is there. And to give kind of a little example, to prove that it's copying everything from layout.html, I'm going to add another H1 that says, this is from layout. And I'm going to change this to, this is from home. And so when I render the home file, you'll be able to see both. So let's do this. This is from layout, this is from home. And Flask does that automatically and seamlessly, just like that, which is pretty cool. And let me just check. I don't see any other questions. Again, if anything's going too fast for you, if you need clarification, just let me know. And it seems like, there we go. My mouse was dead for a second there. But let's get back to it. So this is boring. We don't want this. We want something nice and fancy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to .container, and I'm just going to stick the block in a container, and that's going to just add some nice padding for it. And this container, that is a CSS class that I defined in my style.css. So that'll push everything in and make it look a little cleaner. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually create a nav bar. And it's going to be very simple. Nav, and then a UL, and then an LI, and each LI is going to have an A. And the ref, the href, is going to be URL for home. Very simple. And I'm going to do home like this. And I'm actually going to put all that on one page because that's a little nicer. And so because of the power of CSS, when I render this, like all this styling here is going to make it look nice. But that's going to be our nav bar, and it's going to show up on every single page that we do. So, and well, so the reason why this is looking kind of sad is because I actually forgot to link the CSS file, which is another good reason why you have Flask. So we do link CSS, and this href is going to be URL for, and this is how you access the static files. So static, and then you have to put in file name is equal to style.css. So you can't just put /static/style.css or something. It's best to use this URL for stuff. So that should work. And if we go back, and there you go. So as you can see, now we actually have a nav bar, and the font has changed, and the background has changed to blue. And if we inspect it, you can see up here that the style sheet is there, which is very nice. So let's add an about page just for the fun of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the home page. I'm going to call it about. And I'm going to say this is from about. So again, all I needed to do was add this one h1, and the layout.html, all that stuff is going to be added to there automatically. So let's add something to our nav bar. We're going to do URL for about, and we're going to call it about. So about we haven't defined yet, so we need to go to our app.py, and I'm just going to copy this, and it's going to be /about, and you need to change the function name, and you need to change this to about.html. And so now everything should be saved. So when I go back, you'll see home about, see? And so as you can see, all that's in the about.html file is just this h1. But because we're extending layout.html, the nav bar is included without us even adding it. And so if we, made a change to it, we'd only need to make a change in one place. So very, very handy. But this is kind of boring, right? We're just adding, static, HTML files. That's not what we're here for. We're here to actually create something that has a little bit more functionality. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a secrets.json file, and I'm just going to do secret key super secret. In a production environment, you would make this an actual, long string of random characters like that, whatever. But for the purposes of this, it doesn't really matter. And to be able to read from it, we're just going to import JSON. And we are going to just throw in some boilerplate for this, just to grab the contents of that secrets.json. And then we're going to do this, which is app.config. So now our app has a secret key. And if you want to do certain things with Flask, then you'll need that secret key. So that's why we configure it like that. And if you, actually go to the website and you refresh it, it's not going to change anything. And that's because, this isn't something that is really showing up in the front end of it. But you just do that for housekeeping and whatnot. Anywho, though, why don't we get started by adding a few other things that we're going to need later. So we're going to need URL for, we're going to need redirect, and we're going to need request. And when we touch on each of those, I'll explain a little bit about what each of them are, but you should already know what URL for and redirect are because we talked about it in the slides. So the next thing is Flask SQL Alchemy. So again, this is the stuff for our database. We're going to import SQL Alchemy like that. And the next thing we need to actually do is configure our app to use that database. And so this is our app config SQLite : //. That means is we're using SQLite for this. Same kind of idea to connect to it, but this is all you need for connecting to a local file via SQLite, which is the site.db. Right now it's not created, but we'll add something to dynamically create that in a little bit. And lastly, we need to initialize our database. So db is equal to SQL Alchemy, and we pass in our app. So we've done all that fun stuff. Now we can actually define what we actually want to use the database for. So if I go here, if you look at the actual shopping list, right, you need an ID and you need a name. So we're going to define a class, which we're going to call item, and we're going to define the ID, and we're going to define the name. And the reason why you need the ID is because in a database, you need to have something what's called a primary key, and it's just anything, it can be a number, it can be a string of text. You just need something that will uniquely identify each, item. So that's what we're going to do. So let's get back to VS Code. And what we're going to do now is create a new class. So class item. And we're going to pass in db.model. So we need two fields. The ID field is equal to db.column. So if you're familiar with SQL, you'll understand the concept of columns. But if you're not, just think of it as like a property of like a class, right? Which is exactly what it is here. So ID is equal to db.column. And we're going to make it an integer. So db.integer. And we're going to say primary key is equal to true. And this just tells it that this is an integer that's going to uniquely identify every single item. Okay. So let's see if there's any questions. Can we host Flask on MyWeb? So for the viewers joining us from the University of Windsor, you'll be familiar with something called MyWeb, which is something that the university provides for us to have free hosting. Unfortunately, you won't be able to host it on MyWeb because, as far as I'm aware, MyWeb is only for PHP. But if you join us next week, I'm going to show you how to get a server from Google Cloud Platform, which is actually free, and it's free forever. And you can use that to host your web application. And actually, there's another platform called Heroku for hosting your web app. And that's something that I used first. It's a little bit easier to set up, but it doesn't provide the same level of control as having your own server. So that's why next week I'm going to show you how to actually get your own server up and running and configured. So stay tuned for that. But no, unfortunately on MyWeb, I don't believe you're going to be able to get Flask up and running. Anywho, though, let's continue. So we also need a field called name, and this is going to be another db.column, but in this case, it's going to be a db.string. And we need to pass in the max length. So I'm going to say 256 characters. That means you can only use strings up to 256 characters in it. And we're going to say nullable is equal to false. And what that means is that you need to have this defined to be able to have an item. Because what's the purpose of having an item that doesn't have a name defined for it, right? So this nullable is equal to false just makes it so that if you're not defining what the name is, then it's not going to work. And let's see. I'm just going to copy and paste this in, which basically is, if you're familiar with Java, it's kind of like toString. If you ever wanted to print out an item, this is what runs this repr self, and I'm just returning a string that just contains the contents of the item. But yeah. So what we've done now is we've configured our database. We've created our entry in the database, our table or our model, whatever you want to call it. But as you can see, there is no site.db, right? So when this tries to run, if you ever try and do stuff to the DB, it's not going to work because it's going to say, wait, where is site.db? It's not found. So the most common way of creating the database is to open up a Python shell, so Py or Python 3, whatever it is, and then you do from app. So app is, app.py, so from app import db, and give it a sec. And again, this is just, a warning, but you don't have to worry about it. And then you have to run something called db.create. Actually, let me make sure I get this right. db.create _ all. And once I hit enter, it's going to create the site.db. And there you see, that's our database right there. But the thing that kind of sucks about this is, if you're deploying your website to a new place, you don't want to have to manually do that, right? So how do we do that automatically? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to import OS, and this is just a module that's going to help to say whether or not the site.db is found. And we're going to do if not, let's scroll down, if not os.path.exists site.db, which basically means if there is no file that's called site.db, we're going to db.create all. So this right here just automatically creates the database if it's not already created. And to prove that, let me delete it. And you can delete the database just by deleting the file. And we're going to do py app.py, and it's going to spin up Flask, and it's also going to create the database. So we'll give it that, and there you go. Site.db is created. Cool. So we've got our routes. We've got our database set up. How do we actually talk to it, right? How do we talk to the database? How do we get data on it and get data off it? So the first thing that we can do is create a new route, which is going to have a form for you to create new items. So I just want to make sure I get it correct so that it's the same as the sample code. So we're going to do /add. And we have to add something extra. Methods equal get post. And this just says that you can submit a form to it, which is how we're going to get the information. So you can submit a post request which is the request that we use to grab the data from the website, right? So we're going to define add. So first thing we got to do is say there's basically two things that can happen. Either a user is coming to /add because they want to view the template, the HTML file, so that they can add something, or they're sending a request to /add where they inputted the information in a form. So when you submit the form, it goes to /add and it performs something. So what we need to do is just very simply, if request.method is equal to post. So if this is a post request, and I'm just going to pass for now, and then else. So what this is, if a form is submitted, essentially, and this else is if a user is going to the page, right? And so if the user is going to the page, all they want to do is they want to see the template. So we're going to return render template, and we're going to call it add.html. Great. So I'm going to save that. And let me just make sure there are no questions. And I don't see any, which is good. So let's go back to templates, and we're going to, I'm actually just going to copy the home page again, and we're going to create our add.html. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to copy some stuff. And basically, I'm just going to add an h1, which says add an item to the shopping list. I'm going to define a form with the method of post, and then two text inputs. One is going to be called name, which is for the item name, and the other one is called submit. So we're going to save that, and we're going to go back to the layout, and we're going to add it to our nav bar. So URL for add, and we're going to call it add item. So we save that, and our server is still running. So let's go back to our local file. And there you go. So we have home, we have about, and we have add item. And here's our form. Very simple. So we've got all that configured, which is great. But how do we actually, get it so that I'm going to do about, or I'll do apples. I'll submit it, and we're going to get an error. And that's because we haven't defined what happens when they submit a form. So just going back to the code, we're going to go back to app.py. And where we said pass before, now we actually have to include the logic. So the first thing we need to do is get the name. So we're going to call it item name. We're going to just define a variable is equal to request.form and name. And so what this means is it's going to look at the form, which is defined in add.html, and it's going to look for something with the name equal to name. So it looks for this one here, and it grabs the value of it. So let's go back to app.py. And so now that we have the item name, we have to create a new item. So item is equal to, and we're going to instantiate the item class, and we're just going to pass in the name. Name is equal to, or name is equal to item name. So we've created a new item, but now we have to add it to our database. So we're going to db.session.add item, which adds it to the database, and then you have to do db.session.commit, and that's just going to make sure that the changes are saved in the database. So after that, you just need to return a redirect and URL for add. So this is basically saying, okay, the form is submitted. Now let's go back to add, and then it'll go and render this add.html file. So home about add item, and we're going to add apples. And we're going to hit submit. And now it's in our database. But, okay, that's great and all, but how do I see them? Right? We can't tell that it's actually in there. I can promise you it should be in there, but, we don't know, right? So the next thing we got to do then is create a view route. So let's do that. App.route. And we're going to do /view. And we're going to call it def view. And I forgot that. There we go. And now, so what you need to do is actually query the items. So we're going to do items, which is a list of items, is equal to item.query.all. And what this will do is it'll query all of the items in the database, and it'll return it in this items list. The next thing we need to do is render the view template, right? So we're going to return render template view.html. But we're not done because we need to actually pass in these items so that Flask can, render some stuff with it, right? So what we need to do is say items is equal to items. And so now when we go to our view.html, we're going to use this items that we defined here to kind of iterate through and create something. So once again, I'm going to copy home.html, and we're going to call it view.html. And once again, in the interest of time, for some of this stuff, I'm just going to copy and paste it. So we're going to have an h1 that says view shopping list. We are going to define a table, and we're going to make a row with 2 headings, which is ID, actually 3. So we need ID, name, and we're going to have one for actions, which we'll get into in a little bit, but for now we're just going to ignore it. So the next thing is, so if we just render this, which actually let me add view to the navbar in our layout.html, view items. So right now, and did you mean home instead? I think I may have forgot to save my app.py. And let's go to view. And there you go. So there's our table. Now what we need to do is iterate through all the items and then render some rows for it, right? So let's do that. Okay, so let's get back to app.py. And so we've passed in these items. So now we can go to view.html and we can do something very cool. We can do for item in items and end for. This is going to render everything in between these 2 lines for every single item in that items array that we passed in. So what do we need? Well, we need a row, and we need, a couple of things in the row. So we need the item.id. So item is an item object, right? And we defined the ID field. So that's what that is. And then another one for item.name. And then also, so the third one is going to correspond to this actions column. And we're just going to do a couple of A's. And we're not going to do anything with them yet, but we have to create, update, and delete routes. And then we're going to put in the URL for that in here. But for right now, we can't do that. So there we go. And as you can see from before, our apples item that I added is here. And if we add another one, if we say pears, and we say oranges, and we say bananas, we go view, and they're all here. Cool. So we have the create and we have the read part of CRUD. Now we just need the update and delete. And this is, especially delete is super, super simple to do. So let's get back to here and we'll go to our app.py and I'm going to define delete first because it's the easiest. App.route. So again, this is where it gets a little fuzzy because you actually have to pass in the ID of the item that you want to delete. So you have to pass it into here. So we're going to do /delete / and then remember anything in between the greater than and less than symbols is going to be, like a variable. So we're going to do int ID because ID is of type int. And that's good. And then we're going to do def delete. And we got to pass in that ID that we put in here. So we put that in there. And there we go. So the first thing we got to do is, okay, we have the ID of the item, but now we need to delete it, right? So item is equal to item, capital I, dot query. So we're going to, do a query on the item table, and then get or 404. And then we're going to pass in the ID. So what this get or 404 does is, like if you go back, 1 is a valid ID, so it's going to return this item. But if you put in 5, which is not a valid ID, it's going to throw a 404 error, right? And if you know any website, you go to google.com / a bunch of random characters, you're going to get a 404 error. And that's what this would do. So that's super handy. So we've got the item. Now we need to delete it. So it's just db.session.delete. And you just pass in the item. But remember, whenever you do something to the database, you need to db.session.commit. So many times I forgot to commit, and it just returns unexpected results, right? And the next thing we're going to do is just redirect to URL for view. So after we delete it, we're just going to go back to the view because that's easier. So now that we have this defined, we can go back to the view.html and we can actually define it here. So remember, we called our function delete and we need to pass in ID. So go back to view, we say URL for delete, and then pass in the ID. ID is equal to item.id. And let me just make sure that looks all good. So we save that. And so we refresh. So now this delete, if you look in the bottom left, it's tough to see. You might not be able to see it on stream, but it actually gives the URL that you're looking at. So you hit that delete button, and I'll hit like number 2. And as you can see, so I hit the delete, it went to the delete route, performed all the stuff, deleted it from the database, and then it went back to view because that's what we told it to do. So now that, I forget what it was like pairs or something. Pairs is no longer in the database. It is deleted, gone. All right. And let me check. And there's no questions, but it looks like Chris is happy that they're actually there. Yeah, it's really cool because, and if you look at the HTML, so remember we did like this for item in items. So if we actually go in there in the table, you can see all of these rows, right? With all the stuff actually defined. And this is all generated automatically just based off of that for loop that we did. So very cool and very simple. In just a few lines of code, you can add all this stuff automatically. So very, very cool. So we're almost there. We're almost done. All we need to do is add the delete. And there we go. Mouse was being weird. Okay. Rip the pears. Yeah, I know. It's a shame the pears had to die. And you know what? While we're here, we can also delete the apples because we don't like apple, right? No, we don't. We love our apple friends. Okay, so next thing we got to do, very simply, we need to do update. And it's going to be very similar to add.html. So let's actually copy and paste this. Because, like I said, it's very, very similar to add. So again, we need get and post. This time we're going to do /update. And we also need to pass in the ID, like with delete, because we need to know which item we're actually updating. And then again, make sure you rename the function name, because if you don't, it will cause errors, and it's happened many times with me where that has happened. So the first thing we need to do before we actually check this stuff is, and actually I got to throw the ID in there too. First thing is we need to do the same thing as this. We need to do item is equal to item.query.getWord404 ID, because we need to actually get the items that we can update it. So, and we can actually not do these two lines, and all we need to do is say item.name is equal to request.form name. And then, so we've changed the item object that we defined up here. And then all we have to do is just commit it and then return a redirect URL for, and I will go to view because that probably makes the most sense. And then we're going to create update.html, but just one other thing, we need to add the item. So item is equal to item, right? Because we need to know what the actual item's value is for us to, update it. So, well, actually, technically we don't. And actually, I'm going to do it without that first, just to show you how it works. So we're going to make our update.html, and all of this is good. And we're just going to say update item. Cool. So next thing I need to do is add this to our view. So again, URL for 8, and ID is equal to item.id. Now we should, all of that should be good. We should be able to go. Okay, so here we are. And something is not working right. Okay, that was weird. It didn't have the CSS in there for some reason. Kind of weird, but whatever. So let's click on update, and you can see update item. And actually, let's go back. So we're changing oranges. So let's change oranges to orange juice. And when we hit submit, there you go. It says orange juice now. But the thing that kind of sucks about this is, if you hit update, you don't know what you're updating and what you're changing it to, right? So the way we do that is what I was doing before. which is going back here, and we actually pass in the item. So item is equal to item. And then when I go to update.html, instead of this placeholder, I'm actually going to dynamically set to the value. And if you're familiar with like JavaScript and HTML, this value basically just defines this is the value of this input field, right? So we're going to say value is equal to, and we're going to dynamically say item.name, right? Because we want the item's name to be in there automatically for us when we go to update it. So let's just go to view items again, and we go to update. And as you can see, look at that. Orange juice is already there for us. And that makes it a lot easier to just get rid of it and put pairs. And there you go. The pairs have been revived. And yeah, that's actually it. So like I said, there's a lot of different ways that you can make this a lot nicer. I encourage you to look into Flask Login, which is a library that handles user authentication, and it's actually super easy to deal with, and it'll definitely help. You can get started and actually create like a blog website or like some social media website or something, who knows. But yeah, just with this create, read, update, and delete, you can do so much. And so I recommend, again, if you go to flask.winhacks.ca, you'll be able to come here and you'll see all this code. It's probably not exactly the same. Like for example, like there's no about page because this is what I prepared earlier, but it's pretty much the same and it'll work right out of the box. And if you want to play around with the finished product, this flask-workshop.m.borne.ca, that's how you get there. And but yeah. Oh, and yeah, that's something that I didn't add, is I didn't add an add item thing there. But again, little things you can do to improve it. And I encourage you to, even if you just fork this repository, take the base code, change things around a little bit, and play with it, make something cool. One thing I do want to let you know is if you're going to change this, which is the item. So if you make any changes to the database, just make sure that you delete the site.db file. So you want to delete it, and then it'll recreate it with the changes that you made. There are ways to automatically make changes to it, and my mind is blanking on what it's called. Oh, it's called database migrations, right? So there's something called, I think it's called Flask-migrate, and that's how you handle like database changes and stuff. But if you're just making something simple for a hackathon, then you can just make the changes, delete the database, and then rerun the app, and it'll be good to go. But yeah, I think that's about it. So you might be wondering how to get this online on the web, and I'm not going to go over this week, but next week I'm going to be showing you exactly how I deployed this particular website to the cloud using Google Cloud Platform, right? And the cool thing is, like I said earlier, it's completely free. So you can rent a server from Google Cloud Platform and get a little bit more experience with Linux and a little more experience with like servers and whatnot, systems and administration and all that stuff. So it's a cool thing to know how to do. And plus, the way I'll be showing you will have HTTPS working by default, which is really awesome. But yeah, so that's about it for me for this presentation. So are there any questions before we close it up? And I'm going to add the lo-fi in. And thank you everyone for joining us. It was a pleasure presenting to this to you all. And, I really hope that you all had the chance to learn something new. I know learning Flask for me was a turning point in my own journey as a developer, because it allowed me to start making, real stuff, right? And it actually helped me get my first job related to coding, which was as a research assistant, which I'm still doing to this day. So definitely don't discount Flask, it's a great thing to know. But yeah, that's about it for me. I don't see any questions. So thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And if you, want to chat, talk about the stuff we talked about in the workshop, if you want to become a WinHacks hacker, you want to win some money, you want to make some cool stuff, go to discord.winhacks.ca. And if you're already there and you're not a hacker, go to apply.winhacks.ca and, become a verified hacker, because that's what we want to see. But yeah, that's about it for me.